good friend, Pastor Mark Carter. Today, we are kind of having an off-the-cuff discussion, I would say. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
And we're jumping into the conversation about gender fluidity and transgender ideology and how the Bible relates to gender and sexuality and the mindset that seems so prevalent and growing in modern culture.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's obviously a minefield to step into with a lot of deep and very strong feelings on all sides of the issue. And so I want to approach this with a level of grace and kindness towards people who have strong feelings and who are going through a sort of transition or a detransition or has gender dysphoria and struggles with how they perceive their own sexuality and gender. That this is not a light or easy topic to be talking about. This is a very deep challenge for some people, and they matter. They have value. And I think this is one of the most beautiful things about the worldview of the scripture is that we preach and we teach that every human being has inherent value because mankind is created in God's image to be God's image bearers, that we are supposed to be representatives of him. And whether you agree with my take or Pastor Mark's take on sexuality and gender in the Bible, we still believe that you have value and you matter. And my intention and goal is still to portray God's love towards anyone who is in that position.
Mm-hmm. Well said. I think one of the dangers in a conversation like this is that letting it become too political, because in a lot of the conversations and people that I'm listening to or reading about, it often is trying to deal with the politics of individual rights or freedoms or hate speech or this or that, like all of these different ideas to either promote or attack an idea, and in this case, transgenderism or dysphoria, gender dysphoria. And I think what you were just saying is what I agree with, and that is that we uphold the dignity of individual people based on being made in the image of God. And so to address an issue like this is to say this is something that some people are going through or considering. And there's a lot of voices out there that would say, yes, this, giving an opinion or a judgment on transgendering or transgenderism and trying to influence one way or the other. And we are simply doing the same. Individual people, we want to love, support, and promote. And this idea is what we're addressing. And even so, it could be hard for some people to hear, or it could be objectionable on a ideological or a political front to some people as well. But so be it.
Yeah. And I would like to add to that this idea that I'll just be upfront about it. And if this leads to you shutting off the podcast, that's okay. And if this leads to you wanting to continue to listen to our perspective, I don't want to lure anyone in to hear a perspective that they're not willing to hear. If you're just not in a place where you want to hear people who have a different perspective than your own, then perhaps this is not the podcast for you. But I believe that biology determines gender. And I believe that it is loving to say that, and to point that out to someone, even someone who struggles with gender dysphoria and who does not want to live life as the gender they are born as. And to me, there's a message of self-acceptance and love in saying that you are the gender that you were born as. To me, it seems and comes across as self-rejection, and even in some cases a level of self-hatred and displeasure with who you are and who you are made to be. When you say, I don't want to be male or female the way that I was created, or the language that many people use now, the gender that you were assigned at birth. To me, that seems harmful to the person who rejects their own gender. And
Mm.
I want to say that you were created male or female, and that is beautiful. And even if you find yourself in a season of life where that seems difficult and hard and fraught with self-loathing or sadness, there's a way to get help to get out of that place and come to a place where you love yourself for who you truly are.
Mm. Yeah, that's absolutely a good word. Um, it's true, I believe, backed up from scripture, and so desperately needed, so desperately needed today, for people, especially young people growing up, needing to know that there's some meaning, there's some value to who they are as a person, and a way of navigating all of these voices and ideas and opinions that come at a person. um, and this is just one area of life. There's countless areas where there's similar hard decisions. The thing with this, this idea of transgenderism, is if someone goes ahead with some sort of surgery or chemical treatment through some sort of drugs, it alters their body forever. And the consequences are just so incredibly drastic that, um we want to discuss this and provide a positive message, and just bring God's light to bear on this.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and yeah, on that note, I'd like to say, don't believe the lie that hormone treatment, um, or hormone blockers is reversible and will have no long-term effect on your body. Um, it's just not true that you can do this with no long-term consequence.
Mm.
Um, it's a claim that is often made, but there hasn't been widely practiced medical transition for a long time. So there are no studies that will prove that this is safe and reversible.
Hmm.
But it's very easy to see when you look at detransitioners, particularly, um, or people who have been on hormone treatment for a long time, especially the ones that have been at it during their puberty. that this is this is having a physical effect on their body, that I don't know that it's I don't know that it's wise to listen only to the people that will make money from having you continue on these hormones.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. Make sure we're paying attention to where the money trail is, right?
I think that's valid. I think it's wise to be slow in decisions
Hmm.
on medical treatment. Hear different opinions.
Hmm. Absolutely. Do you want to look at a scripture then, and kind of just actually start walking through these things that we've been hinting at?
Yeah. So the first passage to look at, I think, is very obviously the creation narrative in Genesis. And this is the passage that is brought up both by people who argue that there are only two genders, and that gender is tied to sex, and also it is an argument that is brought up by people who support the idea of gender fluidity. um, and yeah, I think it's interesting to look at both of the arguments here. So
Hmm.
um, Genesis 1 verse 26 and 27, and this is in the creation narrative, says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the earth, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." Um, and so the simple argument from this text is God created human beings, male and female. And so this is part of the created order. Uh, your maleness and femaleness flows from your biology and the way that you are created. But that seem seem accurate to
Hmm.
how you understand the simple interpretation.
Yeah, yeah. And we've talked in the past, like, why reading Genesis, why scripture is important for telling us about what life is like and providing some meaning to how do we know uh, what it means to be a sexual being and to have, I mean, gender is an idea that we could talk about that. It's kind of a more recent term, right? That has more to do with the expression of our sexual personality or whatever. But um, yeah, we go back to Genesis because we believe that we are created by God in a very specific design. And within that male and female, and again, you mentioned biology, it comes down to some very basic things of reproduction, sexual reproduction, requiring a male and a female, and very specific biology around that. And we see a pattern in all of creation, in biological living beings, whether it's in animals or plants, a similar kind of function of two different sexual parts coming together in order to reproduce. And and so we look at that and we receive this as a truth about who we are as humans. And this is in distinction to, you could say, kind of an atheistic evolutionary mindset that would see life forming randomly through random chance, through kind of influences of whatever's going on, just countless mutations over time that all of a sudden led to humans, right? And so if that were the case, and there is no basis for making a judgment call on on one thing over another, then sure, you're left with a different set of parameters for deciding what's good or bad, what's useful or not useful. We're saying we believe that humans are created, we're designed by God, and one of the side effects of that, one of the results or consequences is that we continue to be responsible to God, um, and that we've talked about that a little bit before. But just going back to kind of this idea of this scripture, we believe that this is the basis of what is true and how we are designed. It's not an accident. Um, and we can, when we get into kind of like different scenarios, we could talk about, like, does this mean that there is a great big spectrum between male and female? Is there any room for this scripture here saying there is a spectrum between male and female in how God created us? But right now, you know, yeah, that's what the scripture, I believe that's why it's here. It has given that very specific direction about how, like, God created humans and this is how he created them, as male and female, which of all the things he could have said, and I created you with hands and feet, or he could have said, I created you with hair, or that you
Right.
have teeth in your head. He didn't say that. So there's something very special and important about the sexual nature and difference of male and female. Maybe we could even talk about the later on in Genesis about how God made Adam and then put him to sleep and then took the rib bone out to make Eve. But
Yeah. Yeah. So here's the pushback, the progressive pushback to the way that we're looking at that text. Um, it this God creating male and female it appears in the 7-day creation narrative, which goes from Genesis 1:1 through Genesis 2:4. And this uh, presents a series of polarities that, when we look at these polarities where you have one, like, two sides to it, if you look at it more closely and with modern eyes, you'll see that there's actually somewhat of a spectrum, they would say. For example, in Genesis 1, 9, and 10, God creates, God says, let the waters and the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters were gathered together he called seas, and God saw that it was good. And then the argument would be, well, look here, there's dry earth, and there's the seas. But then what do we do with marshes? Because marshes are wet lands, which doesn't really fit into the description that's given here in Genesis. And obviously, Genesis is not trying to describe every single different state of land and sea. It's just differentiating between continent and ocean, without taking into account there are lakes, there are rivers and marshes, and arboreals, and all sorts of really fascinating uh, variations between dry earth and wet ocean. So then, and they would look at something like, in the next, in another section, there's the two lights in 1:14 through 19, where God created the two great lights, the sun and the moon, to rule the day and the night. And he sees that as good, but then there are times when you see the moon in daytime, and there's dusk and there's dawn, when it's bright but you don't see the sun, or it's it's getting dark and you can still see the sun. And so what then do you do with these things that don't entirely fit the the narrow description given? And they would say, in the same way, there's a spectrum between male and female that's not mentioned in the text. And where we see that biologically speaking is in intersex, that there are intersex conditions, people who don't fall neatly into the male and female categories.
Hmm.
And then the argument is, well, if there is intersex, then there can also be transgender people who don't feel at home in their genders, and that can be a valid part of that spectrum as well.
Hmm.
So what would you say to an argument such as that?
And what do you say to that?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Um, yeah. So, I mean, if a person was really looking for that kind of analysis and trying to read in between the lines, I guess I would say it's a bit of an argument from silence, meaning the main point comes from something that's not said. Genesis is not affirming, and by the way, God made man and in his image, he made the male and female. But in case you missed it, there's this big spectrum in between both of those, and then moving on. So an argument from silence is always tentative, and you'd want to make sure that that's backed up somewhere else, much more direct way. But I mean, I would also say, okay, if we just think about that, and we go along with this idea that that Genesis was never meant to describe every single condition that would ever come along. It is describing in broad strokes various ways of the earth, generally speaking. What it seems like Genesis is doing, it's not describing every single detail. Yes, it's speaking in generalities about what God did as he created this world. And one of the things God chose to do was to at least talk a little bit about humans, which also shows the great significance of people, in seven acts of creation that brought this entire universe into being. Humans were given very specific attention and detail in this creation narrative. And so, yeah, I mean, that's arguing from silence. And really the whole point is to talk about, generally speaking, this is how God created things to be. Most of the world has a very distinct shoreline and a very distinct ocean. And then there are some parts of the world where, yes, there is marshes and things like that. And none of us, we're not denying that there is the reality of intersex or variations on being, just male or just female, and all of the different body parts that represent those categories. There's combinations. I think where I would go with that is to say that an intersex situation is an abnormality. It's not like it's an inconvenience or something like that. I would assume or think that folks who would want to promote the transgender movement would say that's not abnormal, that is normal and just part of the spectrum. And when I say, in my view, it's abnormal, not in the sense of it's wrong or anything else, but so yeah, just to kind of wrap up that that idea from Genesis, it's speaking about, generally speaking, this is how God has created people. And yes, there's some variation in some circumstances, but it's very, very I think, small set. And where my thinking goes then is, so what's the moral implications about right and wrong and living and conduct? Like, does this indicate that a male shouldn't desire to become a female, or that there shouldn't be this transition process just based on this scripture? I mean, once, because I think that would come up. It's like, okay, we have male and female here. There might be this little tiny chance that there's this argument for spectrum, which, like I said, I think that's arguing from silence. But, so what? Where's the moral implication of saying transgenderism is good or not good, or whatever?
Right.
Be my question.
I mean, that is a good question. That I, off the top of my head, I don't have a direct answer to that. Um,
I would think, other parts of scripture do certainly talk about sexuality and sexual practice, right?
Yeah.
And so we probably have to go there in order to trace down, okay, so if, yeah,
Here's what I would say. I would go back to the text in Genesis, and I'd push back against the progressive interpretation that I just recounted. And I would say that this interpretation is a conflation of the categories sex and gender. Because when people use those terms currently, when they say sex, they mean biology. And when they say gender, they mean all of the social norms and expectations and attributes and stuff that we tie to the way that you live out your gender. It's a social construct. Now, I reject that interpretation of the world. I think that the one thing that you cannot do with gender is completely disconnect it from biology. I think that's the radical part of the modern ideology is the claim that gender is completely disconnected and unreliant from biology. I would say there are lots of other things in addition to biology that affects gender or flows from gender. It, for example, is more typical of females to be nurture oriented. Therefore, more females are drawn to professions such as being a nurse. That does not mean that just because you're a nurse, you're a woman. It just means that there are typical female tendencies that do flow from the gender, but that does not define the gender. What defines gender is role in reproduction and biology. And when it comes to biology, so then we have to separate between a transgender person and an intersex person, because an intersex person is strictly a biological condition, where a transgender person is someone who has a gender and desires to be a different gender than what they are, different gender than the sex that they are born as. And that's the radical part of the transgender ideology. So let's look at the intersex part first. When it comes to being male and female, these describe humans in terms of how they are structured to contribute towards human reproduction. Males produce sperm and females produce eggs and have wombs to carry children until birth. Intersex describes deviations from being able to fulfill the role of male and or female in the most normal way. But there is no such thing as a third gender or third sex, because there is no third way to contribute towards reproduction. So some intersex people are able to fulfill the role of male or the role of female if they have medical treatment. However, they cannot fulfill the roles of both, and they cannot fulfill a third role in the area of reproduction. So
Mm.
there is no such thing as a third gender. That would be like saying that there is such a thing as and well, I don't have a good analogy here. It is a nonsensical thing to say.
Mm.
And when we're looking at the text in Genesis, it is in the context of reproduction. The very first thing God says after he created them, male and female, was be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And so it's clear that this idea of be sexually reproducing as human beings, fill the earth with human beings. And you have to live in accordance with your maleness or femaleness if you are to fulfill your God-given sex. You cannot become a father if you are a woman, and you cannot become a mother if you are a man. A man is an adult human male, and a woman is an adult human female. And male and femaleness has to do with reproduction. So in terms of interpreting this text, we can't read into the text modern ideas that would never have been even thought of by Moses and the first readers, and questions and ideas that are just modern inventions. Those are not questions that anyone back then would have had. Moses is not trying to communicate transgenderness when he neglects to mention it in the text,
Right.
as you're saying, by the silence, arguing from silence. It's not there. What he's actually doing is addressing the kinds of concerns that people had in his time. Moses is probably writing this to the Exodus generation that had been treated like slaves and then been rescued from Egypt by God. And they had questions such as, does every human being have value, or is it just the upper royal class, the pharaohs? Because they had been treated like slaves, they're like property. And do only males have value, or do females also have value? And so here's this presentation from God that all human beings, males and females, are created in God's image. Therefore, everyone has value. And yes, we can glean from that the fact that there are the categories male and female, but the point is you all have value however God created you, whatever sex, and there are only two.
Yeah, what a powerful message, and a life-giving message. If that message was given out to children and people who are questioning or feel uncomfortable in their body or with their sex, just simply to say, God has created men and women, male and female, and it can be awkward at times. It can be depressing at times, especially going through puberty, in school and not feeling comfortable in your body and things like that. but just to know and to hear that you are a created person with incredible value, loved by God, loved by others. And there will be difficult times, yes, but there's also love and support, and to not lose heart and not think that kind of a radical transgender transition is the only answer to try and find what you're looking for, find that someone cares about you and that you have value, or to feel comfortable in the body that you've been given. And so I think that is a positive message. It's a message of affirmation of our humanity as male and female, for young people to know that um, there'll be awkward times, there'll be sad times, depressing times, but don't give up, and don't believe a radical lie that's seeking to try and influence people into a movement that has horrific consequences. And
Yeah.
we're seeing more and more stories of people detransitioning and expressing immense regret. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd like to make my closing remarks on this because I have kids that I need to tend to. Um, and I'd say um, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but um, how people feel about their sexuality has a tendency to change over time. And most people who struggle with gender dysphoria in their teenage years will probably grow out of it and feel at home in their own sex when they are older, provided that they do not go through hormone or surgical therapy. Now, my advice is if you are struggling with this yourself, wait until you're grown up to make any radical decisions. And if you're a parent and you have any influence at all, then I would say wait until they're grown up. Let them make their own decisions when they're grown up, but wait. Um, and and my hunch is that you will live a more fulfilled life if you live in accordance with the sex that you were created. Now, there are people that talk about this at great depth and length, much more than the two of us can in a short off the cuff conversation like this. Mm, I have listened a lot to a man called Preston Sprinkle, um, and he has a very gracious and kind tone in the things that he says about this, but he holds to a traditional perspective of uh, a man is an adult human male and a woman is an adult human female. And uh, but he has people on his podcast that present different perspectives and has different lived experiences. And so I would recommend listening to him if you have more questions or want to go more in depth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thanks, Einar, for this discussion and providing some great feedback and posing some difficult questions to me.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Mark, for taking the time and for discussing scripture and this current trend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right on. Good. Well, thanks. And until next time, we will see you later.